Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this new session of the Master's Research in Translation and Interpreting Lectures series. Today, we have the pleasure of having Celia Martín de León with us. Dr. Martín de León is an associate professor at Universidad de Las Palmas de Gran Canaria in Spain. Her research focuses on the empirical study of translation and interpreting processes from a multimodal, embodied, situated, and distributed cognitive perspective. She has explored meaning-making processes in translation and interpreting by considering phenomena such as conceptual metaphors, implicit theories, mental imagery, mental simulations, and co-speech gestures. She has authored several articles and book chapters on these topics and is the director of the monographs series Tibón, Estudios Traductológicos. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being there. And thank you, Esther, for inviting me to give this talk about gesture research in simultaneous interpreting. I hope I can bring you some ideas and findings of this area of research. So I'm going to, first I'm going to introduce research on multimodality and gesture in general and in translation and interpreting studies. Then I'm going to talk about this research on multimodality and gesture in simultaneous interpreting, which is my area of research. And then I'm going to present our methodology and the steps we take when we make our research. And finally, I'm going to give you some examples from our research in order to illustrate some of the concepts and findings I'm going to talk about. Okay, so what is multimodality? As you know, when we communicate and when we produce and interpret meaning, we use different resources such as spoken and written language, gestures, images, music, and every resources a society uses to generate and interpret meaning. These are the modalities. And it is clear that our everyday experience is multimodal. When we communicate with each other, we use our spoken language and our gestures. When we send a message, we use emoticons, we post music and videos. So our experience is clearly multimodal. This is obvious, but traditionally, our Western culture has tended to be monomodal. It has tended to focus on written language, and science, as part of our culture, has also tended to focus on written language and consequently to be monomodal. But since the mid 20th century, the last century, different areas such as psychology, anthropology, linguistics, sociology, and communication studies have started to explore what then was known as nonverbal communication. But what is the problem with nonverbal communication? That this distinction between verbal and nonverbal creates a hierarchy where language is the criterion for distinguishing modalities, and this division of modalities is not very realistic. Also because historically, verbal communication has been related to the transmission of ideas and information, and nonverbal communication has been related to the expression of emotions. And this division of labor is not real, and it overlooks that the different modalities interact all the time in our perception and also in our production of meaning, which is a very important idea. So if we categorize everything beyond language as nonverbal, language remains the main modality. And just research that started developing in the 1970s has considered the interaction between gesture and speech a very, very central issue. In fact, in this field, speech and accompanying gestures are understood as forming a unit based on the same cognitive processes. And this idea is very important for research and for understanding how we communicate in this multimodal way. And in multimodality research, the interaction between modalities has also been very important. It's also a theme of research because we never or normally we don't process or produce the different modalities in an isolated way. Normally, they interact in our perception. So, what about our area, about translation and interpreting studies? As you know, from the beginning, our field has been very heavily influenced by linguistics, and consequently, it has focused almost exclusively in the beginning on language as a means of constructing meaning and as a means of transmitting meaning, following this metaphor of the conduit, where we are transmitting meaning through language. But during the 1980s, new approaches emerged in our area, such as cultural studies, description studies, functionalism in Germany. And these new approaches took into account the role of nonverbal communication. For example, functional theories recognize the role of nonverbal elements in translation, for example, images and layout, and also in interpreting. In interpreting, they took into account the interaction of language with paralinguistic features such as tone of voice, intonation, speaking speed, pauses, size, laughter, and gesture. So these new approaches did take into account nonverbal communication. And of course, in the 1990s, the study of audiovisual translation became established as an academic discipline, and of course, it focused on multimodality. Okay, and what about simultaneous interpreting, which is our area of research? Here, as you know, from the beginning, research has focused primarily also on spoken language, and this was favored by the fact that since the 1920s, electroacoustic technologies were used, and using these technologies, what the audience received was just the voice of the interpreters. And so simultaneous interpreters became kind of disembodied voices, and simultaneous interpreting was considered as a disembodied transmission of meaning. So that simultaneous interpreters don't have a body, just a voice. And now I'm going to speak about some exceptions to this monomodal view of interpreting. One of them is Hildegard Bühler, who surveyed and interviewed professional interpreters, and she found that most of them consider visual access to speakers, audiences, and colleagues, so to the whole communicative situation, to be very important. And this requirement has been recognized in international standards for simultaneous interpreting booths that have to offer this visual access, have to provide this visual access to the communicative situation of the interpreting. Another interesting exception to this monomodal view of interpreting was Fernando Poyatos, who also in the 1980s, which is a special decade for translation interpreting research, approached interpreting from the perspective of nonverbal communication. And as I said, this perspective tends to create a hierarchy and a separation between verbal and nonverbal modalities. But for Poyatos, who distinguished between verbal, paralinguistic, and kinesthetic behavior. All of these behaviors, all of these modalities constituted an inseparable unit within this course, so that his view was very coherent with the view in gesture studies that gestures and speech constitute a unit or two sides of the same communicative system. And now I'm traveling to the present because, as you know, with the rise with remote simultaneous interpreting, this embodiment of the simultaneous interpreter has intensified, and they have increasingly become disembodied voices. And this remote simultaneous interpreting poses some challenges, such as, for example, the reduction of multimodal communication between participants, or the interpreter's growing sense of isolation and their disconnection from social interaction. They feel that they are disconnected because after the interpreting session, they can't interact with the people in the communicative situation or before. And I have to say that at this moment, I'm feeling these things because I'm also remote communicating with you. I can't see you, and it's for me more difficult to communicate and to multimodally communicate in a remote situation than in a face-to-face one. So, as you know, remote simultaneous interpreting is expected to expand, mainly for economic reasons. And for that, it is very important to adapt the platforms to meet the interpreter's professional needs. For example, it is important to ensure effective communication with both partners because, as you know, the collaboration with both partners is very useful for simultaneous interpreters. It is also important to optimize the visual input that the interpreter receives. Should they see the full venue, the speaker full body, just the face? Should they see the presentation materials? All of these questions are very important. And in order to answer them, it is important to foster a deeper understanding of interpreting as an embodied and multimodal activity. So, and now we go to one of the first interesting questions of my presentation, which is, why do interpreters gesture? Why do they gesture at all? Because research on gesture in simultaneous interpreting, which began in the 2000s, has found that indeed they gesture in the booth, although nobody is looking at them. So why are they gesturing at all? And this question has received different answers. For example, McNeil, who was one of the pioneers of gesture research, was one day he was astonished because he observed that the interpreter who was interpreting his own speech was gesturing alone in the booth, and because the gestures were not directed at the partner, he thought that they must have served the interpreter's own cognitive process. So one of the important ideas of gesture studies is that gestures have communicational but also cognitive functions, so that they are important for our cognitive functions when we are talking or when we are thinking. And this is a very central idea of gesture studies. And another answer to the question, why do interpreters gesture, was this answer from Poyatos, who offered a very simple answer. Because he said, because all the sign systems of communication form a whole, interpreters, although they are invisible to the audience, use all of them in the same way as we all gesture when we are talking on the phone, although our partner is not seeing us. So gesture and speech are really inseparable, and for this reason, we use them together. Both answers, McNeil's and Poyatos, are not exclusive, they are complementary because we use speech and gesture, and speech and gesture have both communicative and cognitive functions. So, and now I'm going to present very briefly some of the research on multimodality in simultaneous interpreting. And to this end, I'm going to talk first about the processing of multimodal information by interpreters, which is one theme for the research. Interpreters in their booths receive lots of information. They receive spoken language, paralinguistic elements, the speaker's body language, facial expressions, gestures, visual presentations sometimes, and sometimes they also have written texts. And now with the new technologies that support the interpreter's activity, they receive written texts on their screens. So they receive elements from different modalities, and they have to process them, and they have to work with them to produce their interpretation. So this is one area of research, or one theme of research, and the other is multimodality in the behavior of interpreters themselves. Their spoken language, the paralinguistic elements they use, their gestures, facial expressions, head movements, etc. And in relation to the first of these themes or areas of research, the processing of multimodal information by simultaneous interpreters, there is much experimental research, and it uses mostly eye tracking technology. As you know, with this technology, with these classes, you can know where is the gaze directed at each moment, and you get a kind of map like this, so that you can see these points. The points represent the place where gaze has been directed to, and the size reflects gaze duration. So the bigger the point, the more time the participant has been looking at that point. And with this information, you can know exactly where some participant is looking at. And this is interesting in order to research the processing of multimodal information. And using this technology, for example, Arbona, Sieber, and Gullberg found that speakers' gestures can facilitate comprehension by simultaneous interpreters, which is a very important finding, and very interesting one. And one difficulty with this technology is that normally when we communicate, we are not looking at the hands of our partner, we look at their faces, so that we perceive their gestures through our peripheral vision. So it's not so easy to determine if one person is looking at one gesture in one moment, because it's not the focus point, but the peripheral vision, which is perceiving this gesture, and normally in an aware way. We are not conscious of the gestures we do or the gestures we perceive. So, and now the other area of research is the gestures used by simultaneous interpreters themselves, which is my area of research. And one important idea, one important finding in this area is that gestures can serve as a cognitive support to simultaneous interpreters. because they can help them to externalize some aspects of their cognitive activity. Later, we are going to see some examples of this kind of cognitive support, which is a very, very interesting thing. And there are also another kind of gestures, which are adapters, when we scratch our heads or readjust our glasses, or when we play with some objects. These are adapters. And these adapters can help us to focus and to reduce our stress. So they have also a very important function. And another very, very interesting and intriguing theme is that of the imitation of gestures, because researchers have found that interpreters often imitate the speaker's gestures, and this phenomenon is known as gesture alignment. Here you can see one example. For example, here this participant is imitating the gesture of the speaker. We are going to see later also some examples of this. In communication, in face-to-face communication, we imitate words, gestures, body language, body positions. This is a very well-known phenomenon, which is alignment. And this alignment helps us to create empathy with our partner, to build a common ground of ideas, assumptions, emotions, and it helps us to put ourselves on the shoes of the other person. So it is a very important mechanism we have, and that we use normally also in an unconscious way. Okay, I don't know if I'm going too fast, but now we are coming to the just a research in simultaneous interpreting. I'm going to explain the methodology and the steps we take in our own research. Yes, in our own research. So our theoretical background and methodology takes ideas and tools from gesture studies, from interpreting studies, and also from ethnography. Ethnographic methodology is, for us, we consider it's very interesting for the study of gestures. Field research is the best possibility for researching gesture in simultaneous interpreting, that is also to make observations and recordings in real interpreting situations, in real working situations, but it's very difficult because it's not easy to access real interpreting situations, so that most of the time we have to simulate a remote interpreting situation where an interpreter interprets from video in a booth or in an office. And this situation is not, we are not trying to create an experimental situation. We are not looking for control of the variables, or we are not looking for replicability. We just want ecological validity. So what we are looking for is to create a situation which is the most similar possible to the real working conditions of simultaneous interpreters. And we record interpreters during their interpreting sessions, and we use either a camera or a platform like Zoom. For example, this image is part of a video who was recorded using the GoReact platform, which was used by the University of Vienna during the pandemic. And yes, we use what we can use at any moment. And then we convert the recordings to MP4 and to prepare them for analysis. And besides the interpreting recordings, we also conduct interviews with the participants, which is a very important thing for us because we want to know the points of view of interpreters themselves. And we also record these interviews so that we can also study their gestures when talking in a more relaxed situation than interpreting in a face-to-face communication, so that we can compare their gestures when talking face-to-face and the gestures in the interpreting situation. And then we perform the analysis. We always do a very, very detailed microanalysis of gestures and speech together. Remember that they form a unit, so we have to analyze them also together. Although sometimes we start by analyzing just the gestures in order to determine where a gesture begins and where it ends. We don't want to have speech at that moment because it can bias our analysis, but not then we always work with both together, with speech and gesture. So we annotate the video sequences. And what do we annotate? The text, the transcript, gesture types, and other features we are analyzing at that moment. For example, here you can see 2 sequences, and we are going to see this in movement later. Here is the speaker, here is the participant, the interpreter, and in this case, we analyze and annotate it both and then compare them. And for this, we use the LM program, which is very useful because we can make annotations at various levels. You can see here 2 of these levels, but you can add so much as you need. And here you can see the annotations. This is gesture type, for example, and these vertical lines are the beginning and the end of each sequence, which is its gesture. And then the data from ELAN can be exported to spreadsheets for further analysis. Here you can see a part of one of these spreadsheets corresponding to these sequences. And here is the time where the sequence begins for the speaker and for the interpreter. This is the speech of the interpreter and the interpreting of the speech of the speaker and the interpreting of the participant, the gesture type, gesture subtype, and in this case, I was also studying gaze. So, and now I'm going to the last part of the presentation, which is to give you examples from our research in order to illustrate these 3 questions. The processing of multimodal information, I just have one example of this because it's not in my real area of research. And I have, I think, 2 examples of gestures as cognitive support and 3 or more of gestures of gesture alignment. So let's see the examples. And if you have questions, if you need to interrupt me, you can do it, or we can talk after the talk. Okay, so this is my example of processing of multimodal information. This is the student in the pandemic. She was looking at a TED Talk, a video, and the speaker was talking about bacteria. And as you know, when you watch a TED Talk video, you can see either the speaker or the video, so that you have this multimodal information organized. You have to look at that or at that. At this moment in the video, you could see the presentation.
But when the bacteria grow and double and
so you see the video, an image appears on the right side of the video, and here is what the interpreter did.
Und dann auf der anderen Seite sehen Sie den Unterschied.
So in this case, the interpreter is not interpreting what the speaker said. She says, and then on the other side, you can see the difference. This is her interpretation. She's talking about the presentation, and she's pointing to the right of the screen. So she's presenting the image to the audience, to the imaginary audience, but because there was no audience at all. But she's integrating this multimodal information into her interpretation. She's using it. So this is the example. And then we are going to see two examples of gestures as cognitive support, which are very interesting. Here, the interpreter had a list of scientific terms with their Spanish translation in her notebook. And after interpreting during the interview, she told us that she had used the notebook and a pen in order to organize her ideas. This is very interesting.
Esto nos permite hacer moléculas de detección de cuoro específica a determinadas enfermedades. Y aquí lo hemos convertido en antagonistas al sistema interespecies, que esperamos que...
So, as you have seen, here the interpreter was using her notebook and her pen to point to the different words, and this was, she told us that she had worked as a cognitive support for her, and she was also cycling some concepts, and she was connecting them with each other. And if you look at here, where the transcript of her interpreting is, these square brackets signal the speech that coincides with each gesture, so that you can see that here are lots of gestures. If each word coincides with one of these pointing gestures, and these pointing gestures are also at the same time beats. Beats are the gestures with which a speaker marks the rhythm of their speech. Pa, 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 pa. You know, politicians, for example, are always making this. And in this case, it's very interesting because her gestures are pointing gestures and at the same time are beats. So they are serving different functions, which are both of them cognitive support. And now another example of gestures as cognitive support. Here the speaker is talking about bacteria, and she is organizing the information she is given in front of her, in the space in front of her, so that she's putting one concept in the left and the other concept in the right. And these spatial references help her, the speaker, to reduce her cognitive load, but also help the audience to understand the concepts. And the interpreter has imitated this, so that she has also used the gesture to reduce her own cognitive load.
Bacteria are able to count how many of me and how many of you.
Hacer un recuento de cuánta bacteria de mi especie hay y cuánta bacteria de otras especies.
So, how many of me and how many of you? An interpreter makes a similar gesture just with one hand, but also using left and right. Cuántas de mi especie y cuántas de otras especies. And this is a very, very interesting way of using space in front of us to organize ideas and concepts, because when we look at these places, it is as if the concepts were there, and we can recollect this memory from our mind. So now I have to change very quickly the presentation. Okay. Okay, now we are in the second part of the presentation because it was too big to use it as a whole. Now I'm going to give you some examples of gesture alignment or gesture imitation, which is very, very beautiful. And before talking about gesture alignment in interpreting, I would like to talk very briefly about gesture alignment in conversation. Here you can see an image which is taken from one of the interviews. I'm interviewing an interpreter, and she was asking me because she asked me for clarification because she had not understood very well a question I had formulated. And I was trying to explain my question, and I was putting my hand on my head because I was talking about her feelings. And she was listening listening to me, and at the same time she was imitating my gesture. And I think that in this way she was trying to understand me, to understand my question, and she was trying to put herself in my shoes, to take my point of view. This is something every one of us do in normal everyday communication. We try to emphasize, to take the point of view of our partner, and we imitate their gestures, although we do this in an unconscious way. So the interesting question is that in simultaneous interpreting, where the partner is far away from the interpreters, they also imitate some of their gestures, although in this case they are looking at the speaker on a video, not face to face, or not in a real situation. So here we have an example where the speaker is talking about translators who complain too much, and because she's speaking to translators, she doesn't want that the audience thinks she's talking about them. She says, "It's nobody in this room." No. And she says this, making this gesture, which is a gesture for emphasize negation. When we want to say no, we make so or so. A lateral movement that emphasizes our negation. So let's.
It's nobody in this room.
Could you see it?
It's nobody in this room.
There's nobody in this room. And interpreters did imitate this gesture.
Und es ist niemand hier anwesend. Und es ist niemand hier anwesend. Also es betrifft niemanden hier.
They are making the same gesture, but with both hands, because they are sitting and they can use both hands, but they are reproducing this negation gesture. So we assume that in this way, and this is what we want to research, interpreters are also taking the point of view of the speaker. They are putting themselves in her shoes in this case. Here we have another example. This is the TED Talk video about bacteria. Here the speaker is speaking a very complicated mechanism that the squid has developed in order to produce light. And she's talking about a shutter, and she represents this shutter with her hand, doing this kind of movements. And the interpreter, the student, doesn't understand this concept of a shutter, but she imitates the gesture, and then she converts the idea in another related one, which permits her to go on with her interpretation, although it is not completely precise, but at least she can go on.
And what the squid has developed is a shutter that can open and close over this specialized light organ.
Und diese Zelle hat auch eine Möglichkeit, das Licht zu filtern.
So this sequence is very interesting because first she says, and this cell does have and she imitates the speaker's gesture. She's like looking for the concept or for the word in German, I don't know, has this cell does have and then she says away, Möglichkeit, away, and she makes this gesture, which is a presentation gesture, which we normally do when we are giving new information. And indeed, she is giving new information because she is not giving exactly the information given by the speaker. So she makes this gesture. She says, a way, and then she says to filter the light. And then she goes to this related concept of a filter, which is okay, acceptable, I think. And she makes this gesture representing the filter. So this sequence is very beautiful because you can see how she is thinking in her gestures. Okay. And now this is also a very, very beautiful example, because this is an abstract concept. The speaker is talking about an abstract concept, which is a spectrum. She's talking about the relationship between two concepts, which are not two isolated concepts, but there is a spectrum, a space of continuity between them. And she represents this spectrum in front of her with a movement of her hands, and this is what the interpreters imitate.
Again, it's not just two different, it's a spectrum. They're shades of gray along the spectrum.
Und es sind nicht einfach nur zwei abgegrenzte Bereiche, es ist ein Spektrum.
So in this sequence, I was focusing on the representation of the spectrum, which for the speaker was the kind of ribbon spread out in front of her. This interpreter is representing it as something that extends also in front of her. And we can see another examples. So what we assume is that in this case, the speaker and interpreter are using or sharing the same metaphorical image of something extending between the two concepts. And let's see the other examples.
Und das ist, wenn man so möchte, ein ganzes Spektrum. Da gibt es Graubereiche zwischen diesen.
He is also extending, separating his hands in order to draw this spectrum. And she also.
Das ist auch ein Spektrum, also nicht zwei verschiedene Märkte, da gibt es auch verschiedene Nuancen. Das ist auch ein Spektrum, also nicht zwei verschiedene Märkte, da gibt es auch verschiedene Nuancen.
So each of the interpreters represent this continuity between concepts in a slightly different way, but we assume that all of them are sharing with the speaker this metaphorical idea of a spectrum, which is not a physical one, but a metaphorical one. And we are now in the last of our examples. This is also very interesting and beautiful example because it's about another abstract concept, which is time. And as you know, in our culture, we understand time as something that moves, that comes to us, or something to which we go, to which we move. But in any case, we consider that the future is in front of us and the past behind us, so that we are going always to the future. And it is very interesting because we have this conceptual metaphor in our minds, so to say. We use it in our language, but also in our gestures.
The golden age is always, whoa, back there, someplace.
the golden ages are always back there. An interpreter.
Nein, die goldenen Zeiten liegen immer hinter uns.
This example is very interesting because the interpreter has made more explicit the metaphor in her interpretation, because she says the golden times are always behind us. So she is like interpreting between two modalities, between gesture and spoken speech. And this is a very interesting question. So, to end my presentation, I would like to remind you, because I'm sure you know it, that this conceptual metaphor about time is not the only one in our world. Fortunately, there are another conceptualizations of time in the world still. One beautiful example is the Aymara people, for whom the past lies before us and the future comes from behind us, which is a very nice idea and perhaps more realistic than ours, because we never know what the future is going to give us. So here, and these people, the Aymara people, speaks one of the oldest life languages in the earth. So it's very, very interesting. And this man is talking about, he's saying from this year, and he's pointing in front of him to next year, and he's pointing to his back. So in their gestures, and of course in their language, we can appreciate how this metaphor functions. So the interesting idea about this is that abstract concepts are also embodied through metaphor, and for this reason, they can also be expressed through gesture, so that we, in some way, can see them, can perceive them as the abstract concepts. Okay, so I would like to summarize some of the ideas I was talking about. I hope you have seen how simultaneous interpreting is a multimodal activity in which interpreters process multimodal information, use gestures to support their cognitive processing, and imitate the speaker's gestures, which may help them to understand the message and to adopt the speaker's perspective. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to hear your thoughts and questions now. And if you want to write me, of course, this is my address. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see, but there are people clapping and applauding your presentation. Thank you very much, Celia. If there are any questions, you can either write them here. There are some interventions in the participations in the chat, or you can just open your mics and talk and pose the questions. Maria Branda from Universidad Salamanca says, "Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Sorry, I write the question. I'm in a place full of noise. It was such food for thought, and I enjoyed it very much. More than a question, I have a comment. I found the fact that interpreters imitate the speaker's gesture unconsciously in order to put oneself in the shoes of the person especially interesting, because it shows the need for cognitive support in the form of some kind of physical representation on the one hand, and on the other, that there is a relation between empathy and translation, whether oral, written, or signed. I really like the golden age is always behind us example, because in English, the speaker used her thumb, but in German, the interpreter used the palm of her hand. She actually translated the gesture. I find that beautiful, and the relation with empathy worth exploring, especially in the age of AI, artificial intelligence." Yeah, indeed.
Thank you very much for your comments. Yes, I think that this idea of empathy is very, very interesting, and that we should pursue it, because clearly it's one of the things we can support, that can support us in this area of just information. Thank you very much.
in this line, I was wondering, because you mentioned that as the gestures have an effect on the audience, that you were mentioning that when the speaker was making two different gestures for grouping on the right and grouping on the left. I was wondering whether, well, that's even in simultaneous or even in remote interpreting, if the interpreter is seen by the public, by the audience, can this also help understand the interpreting per se? If the speaker or if the audience has access to the picture, the image, the footage of the interpreter rather than the voice only?
This is a very, very interesting question. I don't think I haven't read it yet, and I think it's, yes, of course, it's something that nobody has formulated, but perhaps it is easier to understand an interpreter, a simultaneous interpreter, if you can see them, because if they are gesturing, yes, I think you can understand better they are interpreting. My colleague, Elena Zagar, says that the audience hears the gestures or sees the gestures of the interpreters in their speech, because, you know, the emphasis and the rhythm of the speech is also related to their gestures. So that some of them you can hear, but these representational ones could be very interesting, that the audience could also look at them. Yeah. Thank you very much for this idea. Yes.
Thank you. And also, Najat Sujulmase, thank you for this interesting presentation. Do you think interpreter training programs should explicitly address gesture awareness, not just as a communicative aid, but as a cognitive tool to manage attention and memory load?
Sure, I'm convinced of this. I think it's a very, very useful and important tool. Normally, we are not aware of them, but if you know, if interpreters and students know that they can use them in order to have some support, in order to focus, for example, it could be, I think it could be some important thing. And for example, I know that in some cultures, like in China, it is not well considered to gesture, and students are not supposed, interpreting students are not supposed to gesture. And when you forbid students to gesture, perhaps it's not a good idea, because they are not going to have this kind of support. So it could be a problem.
It may hinder comprehension. And maybe, do you know any study, or are you planning on conducting any study that can correlate gesturing with comprehension or even stress? But you mentioned that is clear for you, but maybe with comprehension, so interpreters comprehending, understanding better when they are gesturing?
I know that there are a couple of studies about this, experiments where interpreters were not allowed to gesture. They had to, it's difficult, because how do you prevent some person of gesturing? They had to hold something in their hands in order not to gesture, but when we started to talk, they were doing this, you know. It is very difficult not to gesture when you are talking. And even if you are said not to gesture, you forget it and start to move your hands. And I have seen, for example, images from Chinese students, and they are gesturing in a very reduced way, but they are, for example, they are moving their fingers, and these are gestures, and you can analyze them because they have a form. This is so beautiful, I feel, because we all gesture and we forget that we do it, and we do it in an unconscious way. Me too, although I am thinking about gesture all the time. So it's very funny.
Stepan says, I think it's also important in the case of sign language interpreters that the hearing attend visually to the deaf person signing and not only to the interpreter. So maybe the audience, the hearing audience can focus on the interpreter, can look at the interpreter as well, the sign language interpreter, rather than only the speaker. That may be interesting.
Yes, I think that multimodality is so important that in a communicative situation, everybody should have access to all participants, visually and also auditory, because you are going to have much more information, and you are going to have more nuances of this communication. And there are interesting research about sign languages, about sign languages interpreting and gesture. And yes, this is an important area of research. I couldn't talk about everything, but yes.
Also, Yetian says, there's recently a paper on using theatrical method to train interpreters to allow them to be more aware of the body gestures, of their own body gestures. The title is Using Theatrical Training to Improve Consecutive Interpreting Performance, Lessons from a Pilot Study. So yeah, that theatrical training related, maybe they learn also about gestures or how gestures communicate.
In this case, it is because they are in front of the audience, and of course they have to gesture in an adequate way. They cannot do crazy things. But I think for simultaneous interpreters, what you said, it could be a very good idea that they were also seen by the audience, but in any case, it could be a very good idea that they are aware of their gestures.
There seems to be no more questions. Anyone wants to take the floor?
I have a question.
Please.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And my question is related to interpreters that are blind. Could be the best way to analyze and interpret body language. My question is related to legal interpreting. What do you know about this subject?
About legal interpreting in particular, and I can't say you anything about blind interpreters. What I know is that blind people also gesture, so it could be also important to see their gestures, and for them, perhaps, of course, to have a description of gestures could be it's not viable because they couldn't hear the speech. So in this case, I don't know what could be the possibility or the chance for blind interpreters to know about the gestures of the speaker. But of course, their own gestures are important. And I think, as in the case of the other simultaneous interpreters, it could be a good idea that the audience could look at them also. Thank you very much for your question.
Maybe it's the same, what you mentioned about your colleagues saying that the audience listens or can hear the interpreter's gestures through the speech. So maybe it's the same. The blind interpreters can incorporate the gestures through what is being said or how it is being said. But maybe
exactly where the emphasis is or how the rhythm is, and you can have a feeling of the speaker's gestures in this way. Yes, thank you, Esther, for this idea.
It's your idea, your colleague's idea. There's this as an intervention in Spanish. I'm gonna read it. and then maybe translate it so that all the audience can access. Muchas gracias por esta presentación. Soy intérprete de conferencias y efectivamente nos apropiamos los gestos y los movimientos de los oradores. Siempre es útil ver cómo enfocan los investigadores nuestra labor. Sería interesante quizá ahondar en las diferencias culturales del lenguaje no verbal y cómo lo plasman y resuelven los intérpretes. So for the audience that cannot access Spanish, it's a question or it's a suggestion to focus further on the cultural differences in non-verbal language and how that is being solved by interpreters.
Thank you very much for this comment and this question. Yes, I'm planning all the time with a Chinese colleague to do some research about these cultural differences and how we relate to our own gestures in our culture and how they do it and how do we train our interpreters and how they do it. So I think it's a very interesting question. Thank you very much.
Silvia Gavarro is commenting on the question Steph Papan posed a minute ago. And she says, and the fact that hearing interpreters' gesture is also important for deaf people as they have cues about whether the interpreter is following what they say. It's related to what Celia was saying about common ground. And
Thank you.
And then Brian Gao says, thanks for an interesting presentation. I feel gesture alignment, although is a kind of multimodality in interpreters' behaviors, but also helps processing of multimodal information. So is there some overlapping between the two?
Between multimodality and gesture?
And multimodality.
Yes, of course.
And processing of multimodal information and gesture alignment, sorry, yeah.
Multimodal is an umbrella term that includes also gesture as one of the modalities, which is where our research is focusing now. But yes, of course, there is an overlapping because gesture is one kind of multimodality.
Any other questions? But there's been quite a few, but you have solved them very, very fast. So yeah. Anyone wants to take the floor, open the mics?
Well, I would like just to congratulate Celia because I think it's a really important topic that is not usually researched, it's like we usually tend to explore about the interpretation as itself, the process, cultures, etc. And I think this topic is just like amazing, because I did my bachelor thesis on nonverbal communication, and in that time my director told me no, because it's not objective. There are not enough resources to investigate about. And in that moment she was right because well, it was like 14 years ago, and now well, I'm so happy that Celia, for example, is doing this kind of researches. So congratulations. Thank you
very much, Elena. And there are more and more researchers working on this area now, and we have had two thematic panels in two different conferences, and more people are researching on this area on different themes, and I think it's a growing area now. So thank you, Elena.
Also, Veronica, thank you, Celia. We enjoyed your presentation so much, very insightful and illustrative. So if there are no more questions, maybe we can let Celia rest a bit. She's been talking for over an hour now. And we thank you, the masters, thank you. All the audience is happy that you were here today, and we couldn't be happier. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to all the attendees also, sorry.
I thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. And if you want to write me, you have my address. So thank you.